Mum, stop. Mum, I don't like this. A 10-year-old Chijioke tell her mum, lamenting. Alright, before we dive into this story, please consider subscribing to my channel, turning on notifications, and letting me know where you are watching from in the comments. Amaka sat on the couch, watching her 10-year-old son, Chijioke, play with his toy cars on the floor. The house was quiet, just the two of them. Chijioke made soft engine noises as he rolled the cars across the carpet. Amaka smiled. Chijioke, come sit with me, she said, patting the couch beside her. Chijioke jumped up and sat close to her, leaning his head against her arm. Amaka wrapped her arms around him. You're the man of the house now, she whispered, stroking his hair. Chijioke smiled, not really understanding what she meant. Since Chijioke's father left, Amaka had been alone. She worked hard during the day, and in the evenings, Chijioke was her comfort. I don't need anyone else, just you, she often told him. Chijioke liked hearing that. Every night, Amaka let Chijioke sleep in her bed. When the house felt too quiet, she would call him. Come sleep with me, Chijioke. He would crawl under the covers, and Amaka would hug him tightly. You take care of me, she would say. You're my little man. One evening, after a long day at work, Amaka sat on the floor and rubbed her neck. Chijioke, can you rub my shoulders? She asked. Chijioke put down his toys and walked over. He pressed his small hands on her shoulders and rubbed gently. Amaka smiled. You're like my little husband, she said jokingly. Chijioke laughed softly, but something about those words made his stomach feel strange. He didn't know why, but he didn't ask questions. That night, as he climbed into Amaka's bed, he wondered if other mothers talked to their sons like this. Every night, after a long day, Amaka would call for Chijioke to join her in bed. He didn't think much about it, it was just their routine. He would climb in, curl up beside her, and fall asleep to the warmth of her hug. You take care of me, Amaka would whisper, her arms wrapped around him. You're not like other boys. You understand me. Chijioke would nod, pressing his face against her pillow. He loved his mother very much and always wanted to make her happy. But sometimes, he felt something he couldn't explain. The way Amaka would hold him so tightly, the way she would stroke his hair, it felt different from how other moms treated their children. But he didn't know how to put his feelings into words. One night, as Chijioke climbed into bed, Amaka said, Chijioke, you're the most important person in my life. You know that, right? Chijioke nodded but didn't respond. He was starting to feel like something was wrong, but he couldn't tell her. His mother seemed so lonely, and he wanted to help her. Maybe he was the only one who could. But deep down, Chijioke was beginning to feel uncomfortable. He loved Amaka, but sometimes, he wanted to have his own space, to be a normal child. He wanted to run and play with his friends at school. But whenever he tried to play, he thought of Amaka sitting alone at home. He felt like he needed to be there for her, even if it meant giving up his own happiness. One night, if you are enjoying this story, kindly do a favor by subscribing to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories like this. Amaka looked at him with a serious face. You know, Chijioke, you're like my little husband, she said again. No one else understands me like you do. Chijioke felt a knot in his stomach. He didn't know what that meant, but it didn't feel right. The next day, Chijioke went to school, but his mind was still on what his mother had said. He tried to push it out of his mind and focus on his lessons, but it kept coming back. At playtime, Chijioke's classmates ran around the playground, laughing and shouting. The ball bounced near him, but he didn't move to catch it. He just stared at the ground, his hands in his pockets. His best friend, Tunde, ran over and kicked the ball back to him. Chijioke, come play, he called out, but Chijioke didn't answer. I can't, he mumbled, looking away. Tunde scratched his head. Why? What's wrong? Chijioke didn't know how to explain. How could he tell Tunde that he felt like he had to stay home with his mother all the time? That he felt guilty when he wasn't there to make sure she wasn't lonely? He shrugged and looked at the ground, avoiding Tunde's eyes. Miss Bisi, their teacher, noticed Chijioke sitting by himself. She walked over to him during lunch. "Chijioke, are you okay?" she asked gently. Chijioke nodded, not looking at her. "I'm fine," he lied. Miss Bisi sat next to him. "You know, Chijioke, it's good to have fun and play with your friends. It's okay to need your mom, but you also need time for yourself. Don't you think so?" Chijioke looked up at her. Her words were kind, but he didn't know how to explain what was really going on. He wasn't sure if Amaka would understand if he told her. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. Miss Bisi smiled and patted his shoulder. "Good. You deserve to have fun, Chijioke." Chijioke smiled weakly, but inside, he felt torn between the world of his friends and the world of his mother, unsure which one he truly belonged to. The days passed, and Chijioke couldn't stop thinking about what Miss Bisi had said. It was hard to understand what she meant by needing time for himself. At home, he tried to focus on his schoolwork and sometimes played outside, but he always felt the pull of his mother's need for him. Amaka's birthday was coming up, and Chijioke wanted to do something special for her. He had saved a little bit of his lunch money for weeks, hoping to buy her a gift. He went to the small shop near his school and bought a shiny bracelet. It was simple but pretty, and he knew Amaka would love it. When he gave it to her, her eyes lit up. "Oh, Chijioke, this is beautiful. Thank you." She hugged him tightly. "You're welcome, Amaka," he said, smiling but feeling a little uneasy. If you are enjoying this story, kindly do a favor by subscribing to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories like this. Amaka's arms tightened around him. "You're my best gift. I don't need anything else as long as I have you." Chijioke felt the weight of her words but smiled anyway. He didn't know how to tell her that sometimes he wanted to be more than just her comfort. He wanted to be a normal child, to laugh with friends and play games without feeling guilty. That night, Amaka let Chijioke sleep beside her, just like always. But as she held him close, he started to feel something he couldn't explain. He loved his mother, but her constant need for him felt like too much. He couldn't be everything for her. He lay awake for a long time, listening to her soft breathing, and wondering if she would ever understand. Would it ever be enough to just be her son? Or did he have to be more, even when it hurt? As the days passed, Chijioke's discomfort grew. He tried to focus on school, but his mind was always with his mother. He couldn't stop thinking about the way she relied on him, the way she seemed to need him more than anything else in her life. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Amaka smiled at him. "You're everything to me, Chijioke," she said, running her fingers through his hair. "I don't need anyone else. You're my little man. The only one I can count on." Chijioke's heart sank. He didn't want to be the only person his mother depended on. He loved her, but he also wanted to have a childhood, to laugh with his friends and do things that felt normal for a boy his age. "Amaka," he said quietly, "why don't you have other friends? Why is it always just us?" Amaka's smile faded slightly, and she looked away for a moment. "I don't need anyone else, Chijioke. You're all I need. You're my everything." Chijioke felt the weight of her words. He didn't know how to explain that sometimes he wanted to be more than just her source of comfort. He wanted to be a child, not her partner. But he didn't know how to tell her without hurting her feelings. That night, as Chijioke lay in bed, he asked himself if things would ever change. Would Amaka ever see that he needed space? Would she ever let him be just a boy, free to play and laugh without feeling the weight of her expectations? He closed his eyes, trying to push the questions out of his mind, but they kept swirling around in his head. He loved Amaka, but he didn't know if he could keep being the person she relied on for everything. The days seemed to stretch longer, and Chijioke's unease only deepened. At school, he started pulling away from his friends more and more. He didn't want to go out and play. He didn't want to be with his classmates, who laughed and ran without a care. He felt like he was carrying too much on his small shoulders. The thought of returning home, of being the one who had to take care of Amaka, made him anxious. He couldn't remember the last time he felt truly happy or free. One evening, after dinner, Amaka sat in her chair, her eyes closed, rubbing her temples. "I'm so tired, Chijioke," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Chijioke sat on the floor, his head down. He didn't know what to say. He loved his mother, but her constant need for him was starting to feel like a burden. He wanted to tell her that he didn't know how to be everything she wanted him to be, that he needed space to grow, to be a child again. But instead of speaking, Chijioke did what he always did, he stayed silent. Later that night, after Amaka had gone to bed, Chijioke lay awake in his own bed, staring at the ceiling. He heard her soft breathing from the other room, and a lump formed in his throat. He wanted to cry, but he couldn't. He didn't want to hurt her. But the tears were there, building up inside. He finally couldn't hold them in anymore. Slowly, he turned on his side and let the tears fall quietly onto his pillow. "I don't want to be the man of the house," Chijioke whispered to the darkness. "I just want to be your son." As the sobs shook his small body, he wished he could find the courage to tell Amaka the truth, to tell her that he needed her to let him go. But for now, all he could do was cry quietly, hoping she would understand someday. The next day, Chijioke barely spoke during class. His thoughts were filled with what he had whispered the night before, the tears that had fallen in silence. He felt like he was carrying a heavy secret, one he couldn't share with anyone. During recess, Miss Bisi, the teacher, noticed that Chijioke wasn't playing with the other children. Instead, he was sitting by himself on the bench, staring at the ground. She walked over and sat beside him. "Chijioke, why are you sitting alone?" she asked gently. Chijioke shrugged, not looking at her. "I'm okay, Miss Bisi." Miss Bisi studied his face, her concern growing. Chijioke didn't look okay. There was a sadness in his eyes that she had never seen before. "I've noticed you've been acting different lately," she said softly. "You're not laughing or playing with your friends like you used to. Is something bothering you?" Chijioke hesitated, his throat tight. He wanted to tell Miss Bisi what was happening at home, how his mother depended on him in ways that made him feel uncomfortable. But he didn't know how. "I don't want to talk about it," Chijioke whispered, looking down. Miss Bisi gave him a kind smile. "It's okay, Chijioke. You don't have to tell me if you're not ready. But I want you to know that you don't have to carry everything by yourself. You can always talk to someone if you need help." Chijioke nodded, but inside, he felt lost. He wanted to tell someone, but he was scared. What would happen if he said the wrong thing? Would Amaka be angry with him? Would she think he didn't love her anymore? For the rest of the day, Chijioke tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming back. He was trapped between two worlds, one where he loved his mother but felt weighed down by her, and the other where he just wanted to be a child again. He didn't know how much longer he could keep pretending everything was fine. That evening, after dinner, Amaka sat in her usual spot on the couch, looking exhausted. She smiled at Chijioke when he walked into the room, but there was a tiredness in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. She patted the space beside her. "Come sit with me, my little man. What did you think is going to happen? Did you think he will be able to survive this? Kindly subscribe and watch out for part 2.